everyone. I'm Ray Belli, and this is Words for Granted, a podcast that looks at how language changes over time. Before we get into today's conversation with professor, linguist, and author Valerie Friedland, very quickly, I would like to bring your attention again to something I mentioned at the beginning of the last episode. If you didn't catch that one yet, in it, I said that I was quietly working on a new project that is more aligned with the original, more etymological, narrative-driven episodes of Words for Granted. It's a video-first project, and its working title is History of the World in 50 Words. If that sounds at all exciting to you, I'd love your feedback on a draft of the first episode. So send me an email at wordsforgranted@gmail.com, and I'll send you a rough draft of what I've been working on. Given the hiatus that I've taken, it's been a long time since I've heard from many of you, so even if you're not interested in checking out an early version of this new show, always feel free to send me an email anyway with thoughts about topics or guest ideas for Words for Granted as it currently exists on this feed. All right. On to our conversation with Valerie Friedland about the wonderfully complex world of accents. Valerie Friedland, welcome to Words for Granted.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here again.
All right, so you have just published a book called Why We Talk Funny. Basically, it is a crash course on accents.
I think that's a great description. Yes, sort of the science, the history, the psychology, all of it behind why we sound like we do.
All right, well, we will waste no time digging into this topic. So let's start with a deceptively challenging question, perhaps, is what exactly is an accent?
That's a great question because I think it's one of those things people think they know, and then actually when they're trying to suss out the difference between a dialect and an accent, all of a sudden you're like, wow, there's actually probably something more about this. So accents are about the pronunciation, so the sounds we say and how we say them. Dialect is a bigger sort of category, and it includes your accent, but it also is things that differ on other levels, like the vocabulary you say. So for example, if you call a soda a pop or a Coke, if you're from the South, and do it like it should be done, that would be a level of dialect. Or if you have sort of things like double modals that Southerners can say, could do that versus I could do that, that would also be a level of dialect. But when we're talking about what we really find salient about people's speech, what we first notice when someone talks, in fact, in the first 400 milliseconds of hearing someone talk, what we tend to notice is their accent or the sounds they say and how they pronounce them. And so that really is a thing that we don't spend a lot of time learning about, where accents come from and how they get shaped. But it's so important in our life because truly, when do you ever have a time when the way you sound doesn't seem to matter? And so I thought it was time to have the crash course, as you said, on accents.
Yeah, so I guess my follow-up question to that is it fair to say that everyone has some form of accent?
Not just fair, but correct.
Correct, yes.
It's a myth that there is a such thing as accentless speech. What really we tend to think of when we're talking about, I don't have an accent, which people say all the time. Everybody else has the accent, but not me. It's because the people you're spending most of your time around sound just like you. So you become very accustomed to that sound of speech, and therefore it doesn't sound different to you. So people that come from another place or that have a different accent, that becomes noticeable as an accent. But if you've ever left your country and gone to another country, people tag you right away as American. And they can only do that if you have an accent. So we all have an accent. I think what we mean when we say I don't have an accent is we don't have noticeable characteristics that tend to get associated with certain social groups. And that's what we mean by I don't have an accent. I think a lot of times we think of accents as being regional. And so, you have a Southern accent or a New York accent or a Philly accent or a, coastal California accent or a surfer dude accent. But the reality is accents are also social categories. They're also things about who we hang out with. So it can be about, our race, our place in a particular social stratus or a social class. Even gender can have an accent, or sexuality. So we often don't think about the way that our voices reveal things like that about us. We just think about, I don't sound like I'm from any place. But just because you don't sound like you're from a place doesn't mean you don't sound like you are of a certain race or a certain class and those kinds of things.
I'll just force this fact that I want to get out into this conversation, which is, so I grew up in northern New Jersey in a very Italian-American community. And, growing up, my mother I remember her saying, "Oh, Raymond, I don't have an accent. What are you talking about accent?" And she would, then do like a Southern accent or, some other kind of accent and say, "Raymond, those are accents. I don't have an accent."
I love your version of your mother's accent. It's awesome.
Of course, she does indeed have an accent. And, I tend to think of myself as someone with a fairly flat, standard American accent, but there really are some things from my upbringing that sneak in that are just so deeply ingrained. A famous example of this is the caught merger, which evidently doesn't apply in my accent. So actually, maybe this is a good segue for you to explain to our listeners what the heck I'm talking about with this caught merger.
Right. So the words you're talking about are COT and CAUGHT.
Yes, which for me, a COT is always a caught, and CAUGHT is mostly caught. In prepping for this conversation, I was thinking, would I say caught? Like, I caught the ball. I caught a cold. And I wouldn't. I would say I caught a cold. I caught the ball. So I'll let you take it from here.
Okay, so say those side by side just so people can really hear them. COT and then CAUGHT.
Caught. I slept last night in a cot. I caught the ball.
All right. Now, so when you say that the second time, it actually sounds pretty close. I would argue that you do keep them separate, but yours are probably much more merged or closer together than your mother's versions of those vowels.
Indeed.
So let's just back up, because I think, for anybody listening is thinking, who cares about the cots and the cots, right? What does this mean? Well,
I kind of jumped in. I'm sorry, but there's a reason here. So again, I'll let you take it.
A big merger in two vowel classes. So two groups of words that have historically had different vowels. So when you go back, 400 years to the founding of the colonies, they were not said at all the same. So you would never have a COT and a CAUGHT as the same sound in those vowels. And the same thing with words like collar, CALLER, and collar, I have the merger, COLLAR. So those are another example of words with those two historically separate vowel classes that now for huge swaths of America have become merged into one vowel class. And it's really a perfect classic New York, New Jersey distinction to maintain. So that's where, it's one of those subtle differences that people might not notice that part of your accent, but it really does reveal something about where you're from. The fact that you keep those separate, because New York and New Jersey are places where that tends to be still separate. Even in New England, they've historically been merged in Eastern New England, but not Western New England. So, though it's really a wonderful sort of diagnostic tool for linguists to kind of tell where you might have been raised. But it is pretty much merged for all of the West, all of Canada, and now among younger speakers, including, and I'm not saying I'm a younger speaker, but I am from the South, it is also true of many of us that grew up in the South. So it is really a dying separation that you have in your speech. But I would say that yours, when you hyper articulated them so that you were making them side by side, you did make a distinction. But when you said them in your regular speech, they were pretty non-distinct. So I would say that you have pretty close vowels there. But if we got your mom on, which maybe we should, maybe you should have her come do a cameo, I would hazard a guess that she has much more distinct New Jersey sounding vowels in that case.
For sure.
This is part of a larger process of loss of sort of distinctiveness among American dialects more generally. So young people, not even that young, my generation, Generation X, and those born after have been really moving away from regional distinctions at a rapid pace. So with every generation from Generation X that we've come, regional dialect differences have been decreasing. Now, that doesn't mean we are not saying things differently, because other types of accents have become more salient in the modern age. But regional accents, like those of New York, Philadelphia, Atlanta, New England, those are actually fading pretty fast.
Yeah, there's so much I want to get into there. First, just for listeners who might be wondering, my mom would say something like caught and a cot, along with water and coffee and things like this. But anyway, back to your point about the sort of gradual, or perhaps not so gradual, erosion of these regional accents. What accounts for that?
A lot of people, of course, would instantly say, well, clearly it's the internet. The internet has radically reshaped the way we interact. And I would say, yes, that's half of the story. But Generation X didn't grow up with the internet. And really where our accents and our dialects get established is in our childhood up till about age 18 to 20 is really where we get set in our dialect patterns. So it can't be just the internet because there are generations that didn't necessarily have those kinds of really socially cohesive interactions at that period of their life. So we have to look back for other causes. And what we find is there were some serious demographic, migratory, economic, and social changes that came into play after World War II that seemed to have set the stage for this erosion of local dialect patterns. And basically all of these changes, which included things like suburbanization. So that increased a lot after World War II. Changing infrastructure in terms of industry. So the type of hiring practices that industries did, where they would hire mainly local people, industries started looking outside. They started bringing in people rather than necessarily hiring only those from the local community. Well, that breaks up a lot of the local infrastructure in terms of interaction patterns, how people are talking to one another and who's talking to one another. When you're bringing a lot of people from outside in, that really disrupts the community speaking style. But there's also been changes in where those companies were based. So the Rust Belt was big, but then the Rust Belt started to fade, and the Sun Belt became the place to have a company. Or the South became the place to move companies to because it had a lot less regulatory policies, and it also was a lot cheaper. And this was particularly helped with the rapid increase of the adoption of air conditioning in the South. And that might seem silly, but it actually was deeply impactful because who's going to move a company when you're going to die in the summer, right? Because it's so hot. You can't be effective when you're sweating. So once they took care of that problem, and also with changes in civil rights practices. So when the South sort of became a little more open to having people of all diverse backgrounds coming in, that's when really we see industry start to move in. And this, again, disrupts local accents. So I think the pattern you can see here is anything that changes the way we interact in our communities disrupts the way that we speak to each other. This can be something slow, like the slow change in hiring practice or the slow migration of people from the north to southern cities, but it can also be something catastrophic. So Hurricane Katrina, for example, really disrupted the interactional patterns in New Orleans. And so some of the traditional white working class accents, like the Yat accent in New Orleans, has really faded since Hurricane Katrina because it disrupted the way that people that have that accent interacted. And a lot of new people have moved in. A lot of those people moved out. So it's a lot of those things that also came into play. The increasing visibility of diversity and diverse accents and the acceptance of it that sort of started with Generation X's sensitivity to social issues, that also came into play. So you had this background of a lot of massive migratory social and economic change that then set the stage for the internet and social media to further disrupt the way that we interacted. So it's not the internet that did it. It's the internet on top of all these other things that were happening the last 50 years that really then completely changed the way Gen Z and Gen Alpha talk. So I think we see it really strikingly with them. They've lost the rootedness to local communities, and that's really what changes the patterns of our speech.
Yeah. I love that answer. Because often on this show, we focus on historical linguistics in its traditional or narrow sense. But kind of the moment that you look at anything over some amount of time and try to answer why it is the way it is, it becomes, if not historical linguistics, historically rooted.
And I think we don't tend to think of accents that way, right? We tend to think of accents as sort of these weird idiosyncratic pronunciations people have, and we don't understand that there's actually a long history and a lot of linguistic reasons why people say things the way they say them. And that was really one of the big goals I had with this book, is to kind of pull back the curtain on what drives accents, both the social factors, the historical factors, and the linguistic factors, because all of that really creates patterns in our speech that we don't hear as patterns. We just hear them as weird ways people talk.
Sure. Or you don't hear them as an accent at all, which is why my mother doesn't have an accent. So I want to pause back for a moment and, start at the beginning, which is, our earliest accents come from somewhere. So very, very briefly, I know this is a sort of vast thing to get into, but just give us a brief overview of how accent actually plays into language acquisition at the earliest stages.
Absolutely. I mean, there are two origin stories for accents. The first one is sort of proto-language and how all that developed over time to have the accents we have today. So, there's the ancient accent angle of the origin story. But what you're talking about is sort of the personal accent origin story.
Yeah.
So
single generational.
Single generation, right. So how do we get the accents we have? And accents are really about babyhood. They start as soon as we're babbling away. We are learning the accents that we are going to have in adulthood. And I think people underestimate the power of childhood on our language skills as we become adults. Both how we speak and also how we learn other languages will be impacted deeply by what we learned between the ages of 0 and roughly 15 or 16. After that, really, it's a totally different ballgame. So, when you're first born, we find really interesting research that suggests that babies start being acclimated to the sounds of their language, to the melody of their language in utero. So they actually can hear their mother's voice. Now, granted, it's filtered by a lot of amniotic fluid, so it doesn't sound like a clear, pristine voice. It sounds like a muffled, the Charlie Brown type voice. But we find that even babies as young as 5 days old seem to recognize the melody of their native language over that of a language they haven't heard before. And that probably is from some exposure in the womb. So even before you're born, you're getting acclimated. There actually have been some really interesting studies that suggest that babies might even be practicing with their mouth, like when they hear with vowel sounds, that they're moving their mouths in the way that vowels would be made later. I think that's sort of maybe a little bit overly enthusiastic about what babies in the womb are doing. But the point is, we start learning language as soon as we're, conceived, basically.
I would assume that this sort of melodic or rhythmic recognition has some evolutionary advantage to sort of identify in-group versus out-group at some high level.
Absolutely. I mean, the whole point of developing an accent is that sort of small variations in that naturally occur whenever you have language. So the way that our mouths are wired and our brains work drive us towards certain types of pronunciations over others. And over time, when groups separate, the way that those forces operate on my speech will be different than the way that those forces operate on your speech, because we're not talking to each other. They're going to accumulate these small, tiny differences in the way we talk to the point where all of a sudden I'm like, oh my God, I can barely understand you. And that would help us because in ancient times, being able to recognize who was in your tribe and who was not, especially if you could do it at a distance by voice rather than having to be face to face and someone's pointing a spear at you, would be advantageous for survival. So absolutely, if you could have small ones already speaking like their group and listening and noticing accents within their own group, that would be advantageous for their survival. And in fact, another really interesting body of work looks at how young children, babies are when they start to really seem to prefer their own accents over those of another. So, at 2 months old, you don't really see much interaction, no matter what. If you've ever had a 2-month-old baby, you think it's smiling at you, but it's probably just gas, right? It doesn't really have that recognition. But by 5 months old, we find that small infants actually will turn, if you have two different voices, they'll turn to the one that's more like their home accent. And slightly older, when they're about 10 or 11 months, they're more likely to take toys from those that have the same accent that they have at home. So this preference for accents that are like ours at home starts very, very young. And then by a year old, children have already narrowed down the specific sounds that they'll use in only their language. So from 0 to 1, children have done amazing tasks. We're always upset they don't use utensils and still need diapers, but man, they're doing some serious work with language. So I think we should cut them some slack, because by that time they have just listened to the input around them, so their parents primarily, and they've already figured out of the 800 possible sounds I could make as a human language speaking baby, they may not be intellectualizing it quite like that, but then they're like, okay, these 20 are in my language. And so I'm only now going to recognize those 20. So at 6 months, you can play any of those 800 sounds and a baby will suck harder on a pacifier, meaning that they notice something has changed. By a year old, they will only suck harder to those 20 to 40 sounds that are in their language.
Wow.
So we're learning so fast, but the accent piece comes in between more like 2 and 15. So it's about age 2 where we really start to see parents, particularly mothers, modeling some of these accent variations to their children in unconscious ways, and their children starting to react to them in the ways that suggest there's some social recognition of the value of accent.
Yeah, super fascinating. And I think you mentioned that we not only speak with accents, but hear with accents as well. So maybe just say a little bit about that.
Yes. And, I think it's funny because we are always attuned to the fact that people speak with accents, but it has never occurred to us that the way we hear other people's speech is actually filtered through our accent, which is, kind of obvious when you think about it, right? It would have to be
unpack that a little more, like
Sure.
with examples.
Sure. So, when we hear, for example, a speaker of a different language, and we are trying to learn that language, a lot of times it's really hard to learn some of the sounds that don't exist in our language because we simply cannot hear them. So, for example, in English, we do make differences between what we call a dark L and a light L. So if you say the word L-U-L-L, lol, and feel where your tongue is, the L at the beginning is what we call a light L, and the L at the end is called a dark L. So lol. So you can feel it's a tongue tip kind of action for the first L and a sort of back of tongue kind of action for the second L. Well, we call that a light and a dark L, and we make that variation. But a lot of times when a speaker of, say, Japanese or Korean is trying to learn how to speak English or even Spanish, one of the things that will always make them stand out, even if they become a fluent speaker of English, is that they don't use light and dark L distinctions like that. And American English speakers don't know that they do it, but they do it. So someone learning a language that doesn't have one of those L's, a lot of languages just have what are called clear or light L's rather than that more velar kind of lol, back of throat L. So they're always going to say the L in a way that's lol, la la. And so it's going to sound different. I think it sounds charming, but it will sound accented. And that's because you can't hear what your language doesn't have. Now, when you were 6 months old, you were awesome at it, right? You were a linguistic savant and could hear it. But by 20, you can no longer hear those distinctions. That's why as a child of French speakers, it drove my mother nuts that I could never pronounce the rounded E in bûche de Noël. And so she would actually be cringing if she could hear me right now because it would hurt her ears every time I tried to do that, because that's actually a different kind of vowel than English has. So even the way I just said it then was wrong. So, we cannot hear sounds that don't exist in our language. So that's because we don't only speak with an accent, we hear with it as well, because the categories that are programmed into our brains as children become the categories into which anything we hear get put. So if we don't have a category for it, then it doesn't exist. So what we do as a speaker is we stick it into the closest category that we have. So a great example I think a lot of people can relate to is the TH sound that we have in English, which is spelled with a T and an H, but that's only because in Old English it was spelled with a runic symbol, and we got rid of that, and we didn't have really a good other symbol to put it in, so we used a T and an H, even though it's actually just one sound, right? It's th. It's not tuh. It's th. Well, only 8% of languages about have that sound. English happens to be one of them, but that means that it's 92% likely that if you're learning English as a speaker of another language, you will not have that sound. And so you will have
to... It's funny when you put it that way. Yes, that's right. 90% of speakers
don't have
or
it.
not in the club, not in the TH club.
Right. And actually, New Yorkers there's an interesting New York, New Jersey connection here, but I'll get to that in a minute. So what you're going to do is, because you can't even hear really how the sound is made. So the th sound to speakers of a language without the th sound, it sounds like a t or a d, or sometimes a z.
Yeah, a z.
And so there's a lot of reasons why you get those different variations that are a little complex, so I won't explain them. But they're not irregular, right? It's not just random, like, oh, I'm going to pick a sound. It actually depends on the underlying phonology of your language. So the categories you have in your brain differ by language. And so which categories are most primary in your language will determine which sound that TH comes out of. So it's actually pretty cool.
Yeah, it's amazing.
It's pretty cool. So what's actually really interesting is if you're a standard French speaker from Paris or a Canadian French speaker from Canada, because of the underlying phonology differences in those two varieties, you actually get more likely to get something like Z in French, that's standard French, and D in Canadian English, right? So it just varies on the language. But anyway, long story short, that's a perfect example of how we can't even hear the TH sound if you come from a language without it. So you'll substitute whatever's closest in your language. So perfect examples of how we hear with an accent. But I think what maybe you were alluding to is how we also can't understand people as well because we're kind of locked into familiarity with accents like our own.
Oh, well, yeah, that too. Actually, I was not implying that, but that was on my list. No, let's get into it.
Perfect. Well, one thing I do want to give you the New York, New Jersey connection, since that I know it'll be important to your mother.
Yeah, please.
And hey, Mom, this is for you. The one thing interesting is, and also in Chicago, we have the same thing, is when you look at, some of the traditional D-dam-does kind of pronunciation in those areas, the sort of working class kind of pronunciations of the TH sound, even from speakers that are, many generations American, a lot of that actually came from some of the original language contact influence when a lot of, say, German speakers and Scandinavian speakers in the Chicago area, or Polish speakers, along with Dutch speakers in the New York area, were speaking English with the phonology of their original language. And so that was a very common substitution. TH would be substituted for. So that sort of explains why we get, da bears in Chicago and those people in New York in sort of that working class variety. So it's a really interesting way of how you hear through this accent that you don't even have anymore, right? So modern speakers of those accents, these are people that existed hundreds of years ago that set that into play, and that's still how they hear. I mean, it's just so cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
But getting to the other about, thing about how the way that we're programmed in our first language affects also just the way we have feelings about the accents we hear. That's even more fascinating because it gets to something called cognitive fluency. And what that means is sometimes our expectations about what we're supposed to hear, the expectations that are sort of trained into us by what we're used to hearing, the accents we're used to hearing, can actually make us say that we don't understand people and hear them as more accented because they don't sound like what we think they're supposed to sound like. And a perfect example of this is there was a really interesting study done by a friend of mine, Nancy Nadelsky, who looked at how people in Detroit answered questions on what words they heard when they were hearing speech played. And what she had done is give them just a piece of paper and said, mark down, between these two words like bed or bad, which word you think was just said by this sample speaker. But on the top of the sheet, she had put, speaker from Detroit. Or for another subset of the people taking this test, she said, person from Toronto, right? So she either made them from Canada or from the U.S. Well, just what they believed that person was where they were from actually altered the word they thought they heard. So their own belief about what the accent should sound like actually changed the way that they heard the same exact recording. So if they thought the person was from Detroit, they were more likely to say, oh, they heard bed. If they thought the person was Canada, they were more likely to think they said bad. And that's because of different vowel changes that are associated with those dialects. And obviously people in Detroit are close to Canada.
They're listening to the same audio sample.
Exactly the same tape. Exactly. So they heard the same voice. but they heard different things from that voice just based on a label on a sheet of paper.
Wow.
So, accents filter the way that we hear, and we don't realize that at all.
Based on that study and, a lot of the things that we've been talking about thus far, accents really matter to us socially. Like, we notice things, we infer things, we make judgments positively or negatively. So, yeah, let's get into this notion of accent as social currency and maybe some of the more negative aspects of this or
harmful.
Sure. So I'll let you take from that whatever you want. You can take that wherever you like.
Absolutely. So, we all have these ideas about accents, and not only about who speaks them in terms of the groups they might belong to, but also the social and personality traits that go alongside. So our beliefs about a group of speakers in terms of whether we think they're smart or uneducated, they're good people or they're bad people, right? They're competent or they're incompetent. They're trustworthy or they're not trustworthy. They're dangerous or they're not dangerous. We have all these ideas we have about different groups in our society. A perfect example is immigrants, right? There's some people that think immigrants are great, others that really negatively characterize them, and then they put things on them like they eat cats and they're dirty, right? So these get put on these groups. So what happens is these ideas we have about these groups in society get attached to their speech so that just hearing that accent triggers these stereotypes we have about those speakers. And I think a really classic example in American English is African-American English speakers. So there are, a lot of really strong attitudes about people that speak African-American English, that they're less educated, that they're lazy, that they're dangerous, that they're tough. And sometimes those associations are actually useful to non-African-American English speakers because they want to give off that sort of edgy, cool toughness. And they'll actually take some of those features and use it in their own speech to give off those qualities. So sometimes we have negative opinions and also positive opinions about the same varieties and kind of put them to work in different ways. But the long and short of it is that when we listen to accents, and we sort of invoke these stereotypes, this actually really factors into the way we behave towards those speakers. And that's, of course, called accent bias. And it might feel like, oh, yeah, okay, people make a big deal about that. But the reality is it's really true in everyday life decisions that people make decisions on the basis of accent alone with no knowledge of who those people actually are or what they're actually like. And we see this in the housing industry. People that call with accents to ask to be shown houses are much more likely not to be given showings of a house that's actually available. They're told it's already rented. People that call about jobs and are asking about what are the requirements for application are told, if they have accents, that there is a higher bar for applications than those that don't, and they're asked to provide more materials than those that don't have accents. And then once you're in the door for that interview, we find people that have working class accents, for example, rather than upper class accents or standard accents, are much more likely to be considered less credible, less competent, and less employable. So they're in all sorts of contexts. The way that we think about speakers and their accents affect how we act towards them. And so obviously this is a big problem if you're an accented speaker, but it's also a big problem for all of us because the reality is when we make these assumptions that have nothing to do with the actual features that people have in their speech. A good example of that is if I drop an R in New York, I'm working class. If I drop an R in England, I'm upper class.
Yes, I was going to make this exact example, that it's not the feature itself, it's the feature and the context.
Exactly. And, another example of this is the aunt pronunciation of aunt. Like if I'm a New Englander and I say aunt, I'm very hoity-toity. But if I'm African-American and I say aunt, it will be taken very differently. And actually, both of those groups are groups for which aunt is a stylistic choice that's often made. So again, it has nothing to do with the feature and everything to do with the group that the speaker belongs to that drives the stereotypes we have about them. And because the consequences are so grave, it doesn't just hurt those speakers, it actually hurts the larger society because when we lose that diversity of representation, what we're doing is actually losing different ways and different experiences that are brought into a context, a professional context, a friend group, because whenever we are always picking people that are flock together and talk together every day and are more like each other, then we're not getting the full realm of experiences that might actually make a more interesting conversation or a better sales and marketing pitch, or speak to people in lower positions in an industry and tell them that it's possible to work hard and do well. So there's a loss for society more generally, not just for individuals, when we have accent bias as part of the way we interact.
This next question may seem self-evident to you, but can you explain or articulate why no accent is inherently superior than another?
Yes, absolutely. It's very easy to slip into this sort of lazy speech, dumb speech, they're not speaking correctly, they're mumbling kind of attitude, which we often have about speakers of non-standard accents or foreign speakers that come and have an accent. But what we forget is we don't know the history that brought them to be speaking the way they do. Usually there's a historical reason for that. It's also that what we want out of the way that we're speaking, what we achieve by having sort of accents that bond us as a community when we're members of a group that's maybe socially dispreferred, is we want solidarity and closeness and informality and a way of sort of symbolizing that we are together in some experience that we've had. What we often don't realize is that the standard English that we think everybody should aspire to is really a very formal, stilted, non-community-based accent. So it was developed in the 18th and 19th century essentially because with industrialization of London and other large cities in Europe, but particularly London, where our standard came from, there was a rising middle class that had never existed before. Really, before that, it was all based on title, rank, and standing. So you were only upper class because you had those things. But once you had industrialization and all of a sudden this rising middle class was richer than you, and they could buy the title and they could buy the land, the one thing they couldn't buy was an accent. And so one of the last ways to tell people apart in terms of how they had come by their wealth and standing was the way they spoke. And that really is what drove this interest in elocution lessons and grammar books, which were based on the speech of the upper class, so that these people that wanted respect and to be sort of admitted into the higher levels of society could achieve that. And so that's really the only thing that drove those specific sets of features to be the ones to have. But when you start having a set of features that kind of are superimposed like that, they lose the sense of community, the sense of solidarity, the sense of love and family, the sense of friendship and history that our accents naturally have when we speak like we normally would. And so, what you sort of get in the trade-off of moving towards this, iconic standard speech is you lose this ability of signaling belonging with the way you speak, because no one walks into a room with standard English and instantly makes people think like, oh my God, that reminds me of how I love these people, right? No one feels that way.
Totally. It might get you a decent paying job, but it might not make you feel at home.
It might. But even then, if you walk into a certain community, right, it might get you a professional, decent paying job. But there are a lot of places where walking in with an outsider accent.
True.
Right. And in fact, there's a really interesting murder case that was in North Carolina, the Peterson case, where his attorney that he hired to defend him came from, I think, New York. And sort of like, my cousin Vinny, where you have the outside lawyer, and he lost the case. And, the merits of that one, I'm not going to argue. But one of his complaints was he felt like it was because Southerners in North Carolina were very hostile and found it hard to trust a Yankee-sounding lawyer. And so, or a standard sort of he really didn't sound more like a Yankee, but more like a polished outsider, a slick standard speaking outsider. And so, it's not always the case that standard speech gets you through the door, but it is the case that in many places it will help you sort of be more successful professionally. But the reality is you lose something with that accent. And so, non-standard accents exist for a reason. If it was the case that speaking standard was advantageous for everybody would speak that way.
Yeah, advantageous for everyone and all the time. Yeah.
And that's why non-standard accents are still very, very widespread, because they're doing something for the speakers that have them and something very valuable. And, the truth is a lot of times speakers that are members of groups that have non-standard accents attached to them, even if they adopted standard speech, wouldn't be able to necessarily get through the door either. So, there are certainly cases where it's just, we have cases where you just see someone and you believe that they speak a certain way, and that actually alters how accented you hear them. So if we show someone, for example, a picture of an Asian woman or a white woman, and we play exactly the same recording for them, so the exact same voice, and then you say, well, how accented is this person? Those people looking at the face that was Asian will say she's more accented, even though they heard the same voice.
I mean, this is the same bad thing that we were talking about earlier in a slightly different control setting.
100%, yes, yes. Yeah, absolutely.
What do you think? Is there any way, is there a world that we can live in where accent prejudices can be meaningfully overcome? And I guess I'll also pose the question, should they be meaningfully overcome?
That's a big question, right? That's actually a very important question. It's kind of more complex, I think, than a simple yes or no answer. There are a couple of different things I would say to that. I think there are a number of ways that we can overcome our accent biases. And one of it is simply knowing that they exist. So what we find is when, people are in hiring positions and they are told that accent bias can affect the way they view candidates, that alone decreases the bias. So simply telling people that this can affect the way they view someone's qualifications erroneously, so that people can be qualified but have an accent and you will degrade them on their accent alone, simply letting people know that happens can actually decrease the way that happens. So I think knowledge is power in very real ways here. So absolutely, I think we should work to decrease accent bias. Another way I think we can learn more about accents and increase the way that we attach value to them, even when they're not maybe overtly valued by society, is simply by understanding the history and science behind them. So where do accents come from? A lot of times what we believe as everyday speakers is they come from mistakes or errors people make when they're learning how to speak. That is not where accents come from. Now, that doesn't mean people can't make mistakes when they speak, but the ones that are accents are not mistakes. They're actually historically founded. They're linguistically founded. And that's what I try to peel back in my book, is showing you how this evolution happened so we understand it. That can also decrease our tendency to view the way that certain people speak as errors rather than simply, cultural and historical artifacts of where they come from. But, I think the question that you asked about, should we, I think we should always try to be more empathetic in anything we do in life. And that is how we listen to people and how we interact with them, right? That's what civil society is about. I'm not one of the linguists that sort of says, okay, there should be no standard English. I don't think that is realistic or practical. And so I think the problem is not that we might hold standard English high up in esteem. I don't think there's a problem with that. But I think the problem is that we don't equally value other accents as having a place and a value. And that's where I think
this is what I was getting at with phrasing it as should.
Right. So, and we can help people learn standard English in schools better when we are empathetic to where and why they speak the way they do. So, the current way of taking accented children into the school system and sort of beating them overhead with standard English is just, yours is wrong, this is right. And that really is the sort of overarching strategy. When you have, my daughter, when she was in not preschool, but in third grade, came home with worksheets that had multiple negation examples, and the kids were supposed to go through and mark the wrong sentences and correct them with the right sentences. That was expressly the task they were given. So what that sends a message is that someone whose dialect has multiple negation, like I don't do nothing, that's mistake, when actually it's an older feature of English. That's one of those forms I was giving an example about.
Read Beowulf.
Exactly. Read Beowulf, or even Shakespeare, right? If you don't want, if you're not up for Beowulf, and I get you if you're not, I feel you on that one. Shakespeare used multiple negation, right? So teaching it is wrong, and it's also very harsh on those sort of their self-image when you're telling them what they're doing is bad English rather than what they're doing is an alternative form of English. And so if we kind of rework the way that we talk about accents as being not mistakes, but being maybe not appropriate in this context, we actually find that children do better in learning. And we can scaffold it better then, because we can say, here's, look, a systematic difference that you do in your accent, rather than here's some arbitrary mistake you're making. So there are good practical reasons for introducing this idea that accents are completely valid in schools as well.
I think that's a great note for us to end on. Why don't you just take a moment to let us know where we can find you and whatever sort of self-shilling you'd like to do.
Sure. Well, if people want more information, they can go on my website, which is just valeriefriedland.com. And they can subscribe. So I'm not a very active newsletter sender because I don't like clutters in my inbox. But when I have things to announce or events, I will send out news about that. But you can also just learn about my research and my books. Or you can run to the store and learn more immediately by buying my new book, Why We Talk Funny, The Real Story Behind Our Accents.
And fantastic. And this will be in the episode title, but that's Fridland, Fridland.
That's right.
All right. Well, Valerie, this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much for coming on.